I'm really thrilled to welcome back to the podium another old friend of the lecture series, Sergio LaPorta. And LaPorta is the Haig and Isabel Berberian Professor of Armenian Studies, and now the Dean, the interim Dean, acting Dean of the School of Education at Fresno State University. Now, LaPorta is the author, co-author, or editor of numerous books. He's so prolific that my colleague Sam Cohen told me earlier today I had heard of Sergio before I even arrived at Fresno State. The most recent of LaPorta's books, all of this may now in fact be dated, it's called The Armenian Apocalyptic Tradition, A Comparative Perspective. Sergio has authored dozens of scholarly articles on medieval Armenia, the history of early Christianity. He has been the editor for numerous scholarly journals devoted to the Black Sea world, the Mediterranean world, Armenian history, and Islamic history. Before arriving at Fresno State in 2009, LaPorta was on faculty at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. I think when you, after you hear him speak, you'll all say that we're really blessed he moved to California.
Today I want to talk about the Armenian Genocide, past, present, and future, or its history repeating itself. And so for today's goals, I basically want to give some basic facts of the Armenian Genocide so that hopefully you're all familiar with it. You know, it's supposed to be taught in the California education system. It's mandated by law to be taught, but personal experience has sort of revealed that most people who have gone through high school have not really learned about it in high school. So hopefully we'll do a refresher with some basic facts. I then want to talk about who the Armenians are. And the reason for that is that I want people to have a sense of who Armenians are and who they were before the genocide. I don't want to think of them just as victims. They're a living community today. They have an impact on our world today, and they had a huge impact on the world of the late 19th and early 20th century. Then I want to look at the history of the Armenian Genocide in particular from 1915 to 1923, the topic of today's lecture, and then close it off with the Armenian Genocide of 2023, a more controversial topic that we'll get to at the end. And I found as my years here continue that this new part, this last part of the lecture gets longer and longer, and it gets shorter and shorter, unfortunately. So some basic facts of the Armenian Genocide. On April 24th, 1915, 250 Armenian intellectuals in the Ottoman Empire were arrested, and most of them were soon murdered. That is now the commemoration date for the Armenian Genocide every year, April 24th. Between 1915 and 1923, approximately 1.5 million people were killed by the Ottoman Empire, and 800,000 in the first 4 months. And that rate of 200,000 a month is almost a given for genocides. They happen very, very quickly. The Rwanda genocide also happened at a rate of about 200,000 people a month. And that's what makes genocides so difficult to stop once they've started. And why so much effort has to be put on the prevention of them starting to begin with, because of the speed at which they happen. They're very hard to stop. The genocide occurred in the Ottoman Empire under the direction of the ruling Committee of Union and Progress, or CUP party. It is a defining moment of Armenian history, but I like to emphasize that it is not the defining moment. And again, that's why I like to give an introduction to who the Armenians are, so that we realize that they have a long history prior to the genocide, and they have a present and a future as well. And finally, the genocide is denied to this day by the Republic of Turkey. So the Republic of Turkey does not accept that this was a genocide. They have various explanations. We can get into that in the question and answer period if you'd like. But they do not say that, they say that people were killed, but they don't say that it was a genocide, and they don't say it was intentional. So let's move on now to who are the Armenians? Who are you talking about today? Well, let's first start with where Armenia is. The Republic of Armenia, you can see, these are the former Soviet republics that gained independence in 1991. And there is the Republic of Armenia today. It's a very small country currently, and it's bordered by Georgia to the north, Azerbaijan to the east, and a little bit to the west, Iran to the south, and mainly Turkey to the west. So it's a tough neighborhood. Geopolitically, it's not the easiest place to live, and they're currently going through another geopolitical crisis. However, if you look at the where Armenians lived in the 19th and 20th century, they weren't limited to these areas, but if you're looking at it, these were the major areas in which Armenians inhabited in the Ottoman Empire, the ones in green. So these are what were known as the 6 Armenian provinces in the 19th and 20th century, and there were Armenians in the Russian Empire at that time as well. And as I was talking with even earlier, Tbilisi, or Tiflis, as it was then known, was a center of Armenian culture in Georgia. Prior to the 20th century and the nationalization effects of the Soviet Union, Tbilisi had a huge Armenian population as well. So nonetheless, the majority of Armenians lived in the Ottoman Empire and in this this area known as the 6 Armenian provinces, as well as in the capital, Constantinople, we'll see a little bit later. So what are some significant factors of Armenian self-identity? Like, how do Armenians think of themselves? So first of all, they have a long history. That's a picture of Mount Ararat. That is currently in the modern Republic of Turkey, but it's a symbol of homeland for Armenians, right? And they, following the biblical tradition, think that Noah's Ark landed on top of Mount Ararat, and that the Armenians are the descendants of Japheth. They have their own genealogy, besides that built upon the biblical one, but they think of themselves as having lived in this area since time immemorial, and as having a culture that goes back at least 2,000 years. Actually, I was going to say more than that, 3,000 years in the past. They have their own church, their own Christian faith. They are very proud of the fact that they were the first Christian nation. That is, their king, King Tirdat, converted probably, in the early 4th century, 314. The Armenian Church says 301. It's probably a little bit later, but nonetheless, it was the first nation to accept Christianity as its religion, right? Not more than just individuals, but for the entire population. Christianity was made the official religion of the empire, of the kingdom, very early on. They then had their own apostolic church. It's known as the Armenian Apostolic Church, and they have their own head, who's known as the Catholicos. The equivalent of the Pope for Roman Catholics is the Catholicos for the Armenian Church, and their center is in Armenia, in a town called Vaharshapat, and the name of what we would call the Vatican is Echmiadzin. Echmiadzin in Armenian means where the sole begotten descended, and it's based on a vision of where Christ supposedly came down and struck the ground, and that's where this church was built. And that's the cathedral of Echmiadzin, where the Catholicos resides in that area. They're also very proud of the fact that they invented their own alphabet in the year 406. And, most languages, it sounds like, oh, okay, they have their own alphabet. It's actually a really big deal. Most languages do not invent their own alphabet. For example, in English, we don't use the English alphabet. Right? We think of it as an English alphabet, but it's actually the Latin alphabet that's been repurposed for English, and the Greek was repurposed for Latin, and then it came into English. So that's why we're not able to make certain sounds with one letter, right? So for example, the sound th, we need a th, right? Because we're using another alphabet and we've repurposed it for English sounds. Armenians went through and devised their own letters. It's based on Greek and Syriac, but they went through and created their own alphabet for all the sounds in their language so that they could be represented basically by one letter. And they came up with 36 sounds. The first one is A, Ip, and the last one is K, K. And it also has a significance for them that the Ip is also the first letter in the word for God in Armenian, Astvaz. And the K, this hard K, is the first letter in the word for Christos, or Christ, in Armenian. So they had Alpha and Omega. So Christ is the beginning and the end, is the Alpha and the Omega built into the alphabet. The other thing that they did is they put it in 4 rows of 9 so that they could do math, or at least represent numbers. This is the ones column, 1 through 9. This is the tens column, 10 through 90. This is the hundreds column, 100 through 900, and then the thousands, 1,000 to 9,000. So you could write any number up to 9,999 in Armenian. Math may be a little bit hard because you're getting like F plus H equals, but if you're used to the number system, it's you can do it. And they still use, I mean, this alphabet is still in use today for writing purposes, but also to represent certain numbers. When they want to say volume 1 on a lot of books, they'll write what to us looks like volume A, but it means the same thing. And finally, the homeland diaspora dichotomy. Like other people that you may be studying in this course, there's a homeland. This homeland in Armenia, there's an actual republic which serves as one type of homeland, but there's a bigger homeland which one could almost call an imagined homeland, and that is the homeland of the former Ottoman Empire, where the Armenians lived in those 6 provinces and throughout the empire. And so people today who live in the diaspora, where they've been dispersed, are a time of constant connection both to the actual homeland of the Republic of Armenia, as well as the imagined homeland that no longer exists as a place for Armenians to live. And so that dichotomy has become very important in their own self-imagining, that yes, they may be born here, or in France, or in Canada, right? But they also know that there's another home that they come from, and that's important to them, and that they, especially if it has to do with the former Ottoman Empire, that they need to keep sort of alive in their memory. And then finally, I'm saying, these are some important Armenian notes. This is not by far all of them, but just so that we remember about the important, the first thing, food, of course, that's important. And if you come from the Central Valley, we have lots of great Armenian restaurants and Armenian food that we can enjoy, but also their impact on culture, with a System of a Down. If you're into heavier music, we also have Baba Janyan. If you're interested in piano. We also have Cher, William Soroyan, the famous author, American Armenian author, Kirk Kerkorian, if you're interested in casinos, but a major industrialist, and then of course Kim Kardashian and Garry Kasparov, who was the famous chess master. And Khachaturian, another famous classical composer. So just to note that Armenians are alive and well today, and producing and contributing to culture. We can add, Charles Aznavour, who just recently passed away, famous chanteur in France. We have Zildjian, if anybody who plays the drums, the great cymbal makers. They made cymbals back in the Ottoman Empire, and after the genocide, they moved and they started and become famous cymbal makers for modern musicians. Okay, so let's turn to the actual Armenian genocide of 1915 to 1923. And when I do that, I want to set the scene of who were the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. So in the early 16th century, the Ottomans captured Western Armenia. There had been a period of sort of destabilization prior to that, and the Ottomans, as they started off, they were actually one of the Turkic beyliks that started off in the western part of of Anatolia, and they moved their way eastwards and captured what we know as Western Armenia. In the 18th century, along with many other people, due to economic hardened circumstances, due to warfare, particularly between the Ottoman and Safavid empires, but also internal revolts, a lot of Armenians moved to Constantinople with other people. They went where the money was, to the major cities, and they move to Constantinople and really do well there. They start taking over or becoming involved in the major industries of the empire. They were appointed the imperial architects. They were appointed the head of the gunpowder mill. They were appointed the head of the imperial mint. So they're really part of the fabric of the Ottoman Empire, and particularly in Constantinople. And they became a rather wealthy class, urban class, with leisure time, so that they start also supporting newspapers, literary productions, and it's a very vibrant period for Armenians. And if you thought anywhere in 1850, Constantinople would have been the best place in the world to live as an Armenian, right? That you would never have gotten a lifestyle. Cafes are open. They're producing plays. Yes, it's a totalitarian system, but there are a series of reforms that are being put into place known as Tanzimat, where the Ottoman Empire is trying to modernize itself. A lot of that modernization was based on European diktat, like they wanted the Ottoman Empire to reform, but also people within the Ottoman Empire wanted to have reforms enacted so that there was guarantee of freedom of religion, guarantees of freedom of right to property, so that it wouldn't just be a chaotic system. These reforms did helped minorities such as the Armenians a lot. And so they were able to take advantage of those and become really embedded in the society and do well. So the question is, how do we go from here, an affluent Armenian family in the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century, to here, within a few decades? Right? So from 1880 to 1915, the whole world sort of collapses for Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. And so how does that happen? Well, first of all, the Armenian provinces were different from what was going on in Constantinople. If you're in the major cities of the empire, in Constantinople, in Smyrna, right, you're doing very well. But if you're still in the provinces, it's a little bit different there, where the mass of Armenians are not wealthy bankers or professors. They're basically farmers. They're agricultural peasants. And so they have a subsistence living. They've been doing it for a long time, but the conditions there aren't as favorable for success as they are in major urban areas to the west. And the reforms that were taking place in Constantinople and in other cities in the western part of the empire were not being enacted in the east. And local populations really resented these sort of changes that brought non-Muslim entities of the empire into parity with the Muslim population. And you also had fights for resources, and this was particularly between Armenians and Kurds, as they were trying to figure out how best to operate in this new system, but there really wasn't any law per se. And we have tons of evidence of Armenians in particular writing to Constantinople from these provinces saying that, you know, hey, can you please get the Ottoman Empire to send basically policemen, military police, to reinstate law and order? There was chaos, farms are being raided, people are being chased out of villages, and there was no sense that the local governors were able to do anything to stop it or wanted to do anything to stop this. So there was a sense of chaos and lawlessness and abandonment. And basically Armenians in the provinces started to take things into their own control, forming defense alliances amongst other people, trying to protect their family and their property. And again, demographically, this was a precarious situation as well. While Armenians were the majority, the outright majority in the province of Van, as you can see, that's the easternmost province here. I don't know if that's coming up. So, easternmost province there. And the other ones, they were a plurality. That is, they were the largest of the ethnic groups there, but they didn't make an outright majority. And they were even a minority in a couple of the provinces as well. So they didn't have the numbers necessarily to successfully fight back. So this is where we are at sort of the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. An uncertain political system in these provinces, an uncertain economic situation for them as well. And we're still dealing with a totalitarian system ruled by a sultan. But this comes to an end in 1908, briefly, as the Ottoman Sultan, Abdul Hamid II, is overthrown. It wasn't just Armenians who were sick and tired of the Sultanate. There are lots of Turks, Arabs, Greeks, Kurds who are also tired of this system that they thought was regressive and reactionary. And in prohibiting the progress of the Ottoman Empire, making sure that it would actually reach its potential. So they overthrew the Sultan, who was a little bit crazy as well, and they formed a constitutional government called the Young Turk Constitutional Government, and the Armenians participated in that government. They were allowed in the cabinet, they were allowed in the parliament, and it was a very, I would say, positive time, again, for Armenians. They thought that maybe they could transform the Ottoman Empire into maybe where's the constitutional sultanate that is along the lines of England, if not a parliamentary democracy. I mean, but there are still problems lurking. While there were many good, well-intentioned people in this government, there were also others who had other plans of how the Ottoman Empire should reform itself. Right? And in particular, there were military nationalists known as the Committee of Union and Progress who remained dissatisfied. These are lots of people who are coming out of the military ranks who are inspired by a chauvinistic nationalist ideology that was basically formed by Ziad Gökalp is the main proponent of this, but it was basically on the ideology of Turkey for Turks. And even some Armenians were like, yeah, that's fine. We like that. We consider ourselves Turks in the sense that they thought they meant Turkish citizens. This is not what these people meant. They meant Turkey for ethnic Turks. And not only that, they had dreams of creating or recreating a Turkish empire that went from the Pacific Ocean to the Mediterranean, uniting all the Turkic peoples. All right. So the Turkic languages, the Turkic peoples who are originally from Central Asia spread westward over time. Right, and there are people who speak Turkic languages all the way from the Pacific Sea to the Mediterranean, and so they thought that they could reunite all of these people, even though most of them had no idea that this was going on. Reunite them. The only problem is that there were all these non-Turkic peoples in between that we may have to get rid of. So the CUP in particular is dissatisfied with the reforms that are going on in the Ottoman Empire, and so they launch a coup. They overthrow the government in 1913 and take control over the government. And the three major leaders of this Committee of Union Progress government were known as the three Pashas: Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Cemal Pasha. Enver was the Minister of War, and Talat, who was the architect of the Armenian Genocide, was the Minister of the Interior. He was the major force behind the Armenian Genocide, and he was that of the Ministry of the Interior. And Cemal was the Minister of the Navy. One thing that happens is that these people are really anxious to get into World War I. They're allied with Germany, and Germany had long-standing ties with the Ottoman Empire. Germany was sort of annoyed that they were left out of the imperialist colonial period because they hadn't united. Once they were united, they were almost landlocked, pretty much landlocked, and didn't have any colonial territories, and they felt sort of second rate. So they did a lot to build ties with the Ottoman Empire so that they could get German influence in the Middle East. They built the Berlin to Baghdad Railroad with German engineers and local workers. They trained the Turkish military. And this was not without consequences. Many people, some of the commanders of the concentration camps later on were present for the Armenian Genocide. And they saw what happened there, and they were able to use it as a model that they were able to reproduce during World War II. So they did have on the ground people there during the war. And in fact, Germany repressed any knowledge of the Armenian Genocide because they were afraid that if the German people found out what the Turks were doing to Armenians, they would be so annoyed and so exasperated. Like, how could you do this to another human being? That they would want to end the alliance between Turkey and the Ottoman Empire and Germany. But Germany at the same time is telling the Ottoman Empire, don't get into the war. They didn't think the Ottoman Empire was ready to fight in it, but these men thought that this was the Ottoman Empire's, let's say, entree into glory, right? They can use World War I to their own, for their own purposes, to expand Turkey, to move into the Russian provinces, into the Russian Empire, right? And start to connect these Turkic peoples by clearing out the road, by going up into Armenia, through the Caucasus, and then across the north of the Caspian Sea into Central Asia. Enver Pasha leads this campaign into the east in 1915, and is thoroughly, I mean, we do not want to be in this part of the world in January, right? I mean, it's cold, it was snowy, his entire army was destroyed by both opposing forces, and then the weather and starvation. So it was a disastrous campaign, and on the way back, he blames the Armenians, said that they betrayed them because there were Armenians who were on the Russian side, because there were Armenians in the Russian Empire, but he blamed the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire for having turned coat and helped the Russian forces as they advanced in the Ottoman Empire. Shortly after that, in February 1915, all the Armenians were disarmed. On April 8th, they started deporting Armenians from troublesome areas, as they called them. The big one being Zaytun, one of the first ones. Zaytun was a very mountainous region that was always sort of obstreperous, but they went up there and they got rid of them first because they realized that any sort of resistance would come from these sort of more independent-minded areas. So they got rid of them. April 19th, they started massacres in the Van region, again, starting with the most populous region of Armenians. They want to cut the head off. And that then goes with April 24th, where they get all the leaders of the Armenian community, intellectuals, priests, politicians, arrest them, and kill nearly all of them soon afterwards. And then by 1916, over 1 million people had been killed and 500,000 were displaced. Again, in that really rapid succession. And then by 1923, 1.5 million people had been killed. And I think this map that was done by colleague Robert Hewson, if we look at the reddish areas, those areas show density in the Armenian population before and then afterwards. So you can see that the density of population based on census, and then afterwards, after the genocide in 1926, basically there are no Armenians left, particularly in the easternmost provinces. Now, one of the questions that people do bring up is, was the genocide premeditated? I mean, as I explained it, it sounds like Enver Pasha comes up with this excuse after his loss at Satisfies to kill the Armenians. And this is still a question that's being debated today. So that's view one. The genocide was not premeditated. It evolved with the war situation, and it was a reaction to the loss of Satisfies and the invasion of the Allied forces at Gallipoli, right? So that you had basically they took the situation, they lost badly, they needed a scapegoat, they picked on the Armenians, and then they went in and killed them. That's one view. The next view, there was always a genocidal intent on the part of the CUP, right? That is, from the very beginning, 1913, 1905, whenever they're beginning to start this, they're thinking, we need to get rid of these people. But everyone's you can't just get rid of a whole population. Who would stand for that? Right? So they waited until they had a good excuse, and World War I provided the cover for it. And that the plan was formulated in late March, early April, after Satisfies, but then they decided to put this into effect that, hey, we now have the right local excuse, that is, we can blame them for why we lost this battle, and we have World War I, no one's going to be watching us, right? And now we have what we've always wanted, and this is like a top-down sort of view. There was a group at top led by Talat Pasha and his crew thought, like, now we can do this. And that the most recent view, advanced by Taner Akçam, is a little bit more nuanced, where this is not just a decision taken by the leaders, but the leaders had this idea, but also the local governors, who are normally not taken into account in the first two views, also asked the leaders in Constantinople to put this into effect. And that is, it's a much more dynamic process in which you have both people in the provinces saying that they're worried about the Armenian population and we need to have a solution to this problem. And it's going back to the CUP, who already has in mind this idea that maybe we can get rid of them. And it's going back and forth. But the CUP is only able to put this plan into effect because the local leaders in the government are willing and were already asking for this sort of action to be taken. So this puts a lot more emphasis on this last view puts a lot more emphasis on the local government officials. So but again, all three of these are still being debated today as to which one is the most accurate. I like this last view because it is more nuanced. One of the things I do want to emphasize is that the Armenian genocide follows the classic paradigm of genocide that I'm sure you've learned in this course. Like, pretty much all genocides operate basically the same. Each one's unique, but they share certain characteristics. So, of course, Armenians were denigrated, presented as vermin. They were diseased. They needed to be gotten rid of because it made the state sick. And so we get this language, this rhetoric of denigration that it prepares the population for what's about to happen. And then there's a pattern to the extermination, right? It's not just random. The men were first gathered and held and then marched out of town. They were then shot, or they were bayoneted if they wanted to save bullets. Then after that was done, they took the elderly, women and children, and told that they would have to leave the towns. Usually the excuse was, oh, you're in a dangerous area, even though they were in the center of the country, and that you're going to have to evacuate. Then they were marched through the desert towards Aleppo, and then along the Euphrates to places like Deir Zor. And so you can, that may be a little bit small, but basically when you're getting to, they marched them all into the middle there of the Syrian desert, where they had concentration camps, and then hundreds of thousands of people died there of starvation, usually, or exhaustion. So people who are survivors of that usually went to one of those camps and managed somehow to get out. Usually they got out, places like Aleppo, they were able to bribe their way out of the deportations. But this pattern is important also to recognize. So it was communicated from the top as well. And we talk about simultaneity. Again, this is not something, even though we say 1915 to 1923, the vast majority of the killing happened in 1915 to 1916. And between April and August 1915 in particular, as I said, when 800,000 people were murdered, and then Armenians of nearly every major town and village were deported, thus emptying out the Ottoman Empire of its Armenian population. Use technology and organization, right? As they used the telegraph, newly invented, to communicate orders using a code, but they would communicate orders to the provinces and then would go back from the provinces to the central command in Constantinople. They used the new railways. I talked about that Berlin to Baghdad railway, but that was used to transport Armenians to these desert concentration camps. Oftentimes, they were told that they had to buy the ticket. They were forced to buy a ticket on this train, and then the train in the middle of the desert oftentimes was stopped, people were unloaded, and they were all shot. Or they were taken to the deportation centers and then put into the concentration camps. They had a special organization devoted specifically to this. So again, much like you have in other genocides, the entire state is involved, but they allocate significant resources and significant time to just taking care of this problem, right? As opposed to, and we have letters, for example, particularly from like Arab soldiers who were saying, like, writing back to their parents, saying, I've been marching around the desert with Armenians. I don't know why I'm not fighting at the front, right? Again, they're wasting, quote unquote, manpower, circling Armenians in the desert until they die. And these people should actually be fighting on the front. And then, as I said, Armenians were gathered in concentration camps. So this was an organized event. This was not just random killings done on the spur of the moment. It was also legalized, right? So this is, again, part of the modern process of genocide. It's not just, again, that they knew it was an illegal, inhuman act. So how do you make everybody prepared to accept it? Well, you legalize it. And you legalize the process of killing people, and particularly, and most importantly, of taking what they have, right? So between May and December of 1915, there were a series of laws that authorized the deportation of Armenians, secured and registered the properties of Armenians while they were relocated, created an entire division, right? Commission, the Abandoned Properties Administration Commission, that reports to the Ministry of Internal Affairs every 15 days. What is the status of this Armenian property? And then administered the liquidation of Armenian properties and created a liquidation commission. What does all this mean? What they basically told people was, you need to go away because of the war. Write down everything you have. They have lists of all the property that you have and leave it with us so that when you come back, we'll be able to make sure that you get what you had. Right? Now, this also provided them with a handy inventory of everything the Armenians had. And then what happens is, they create a law saying if no one's claimed it by this such and such a date, they no longer can. It's forfeit, right? So it goes to the state. right? Now the state has all of this property, vineyards, houses, factories, right? So now what do you need to do? Well, the state needs to find a way to legally get rid of this stuff that it can't maintain. So that's what they create the liquidation commission for, and they're basically able to redistribute the wealth to people that to whom they want to give it. Right. So this whole legal process, they know from the beginning, none of these Armenians are going to come back to claim this property. They go through this whole process of cataloging and stamps, and here we know Talat Pasha himself, his own. This is one of the stamped reclamation documents, but he himself, he had a little black book. Talat Pasha, after the war, was assassinated by an Armenian nationalist who saw him in Berlin and was able to shoot him. And he had this little black book on him, and in this black book, he listed all the properties that he was able to take from the Armenians. And this is what he just personally was able to account for. Not that he personally owned it, but this is what he owned. That's what he accounted himself. So we can see it's a lot of property and a lot of industry. Now, internationalization. Even though people say, when you say, why didn't you know about the Armenian genocide? Well, nobody knew about it. It was in a faraway place. This is not so. It was very much I don't like to use the term cause célèbre, but it was like people knew about this once it came out. Between 1915 and 1922, nearly 200 articles in the New York Times are written about it. And they didn't know what to call it because they called it mass extinction. The word genocide didn't exist. I'm sure you learned in this class, Raphael Lemkin coined the term based on his knowledge of the Armenian genocide and what happened to his own family in the Holocaust. So nobody knew what to call this because they wanted to say more than what was normally understood for killing during wartime. And so they start talking about policy of extermination in the newspaper. And American reports were very important because America was neutral at the beginning of the war. So we had our consulate, we had our embassy there, we had journalists. It was some of the most important reports of the Armenian genocide are from American missionaries and the American Foreign Service staff that was there. And so reports of the American ambassador to Turkey, Henry Morgenthau, in particular, and of American missionaries really provide contemporary documentation of what was going on in specific areas. And likewise, soon after 1933, Franz Werfel wrote what became a bestseller, 40 Days of Musadagh, translated into many languages. They even wanted to make it a movie, but MGM actually squashed it because the Republic of Turkey at that point called them up and said, no, this wouldn't be good for U.S.-Turkish relations, and so they squashed the movie. But it was also one of the first books that Hitler banned in Germany because it showed an ethnic community defending itself on the mountains of Musadagh. It's about a small community that was able to fight off the Ottoman Empire 40 days until it was rescued by the French Navy, and they were able to leave. Most of them then went to Lebanon, where they settled, and a number of them are also in Fresno now, and they actually have a celebration every year for that community from that area. And then relief efforts, right? The American Committee for Relief in the Near East, which is now the Near Eastern Relief Fund, was founded. And we forget this, but between 1960 and 1930, the U.S. raised $116 million in relief money. That's $2.5 billion. Probably today it's $4. I should correct this. This slide's a little bit old. It's $2.5 billion of money from like 5 years ago. So maybe today it's probably $3 billion or $3.5 billion. Right? That's a lot of money. It's the most money that's ever been raised in a relief effort for people. Before we had Live Aid and all of this became really famous. Largest relief effort ever, and it included presidents, politicians, celebrities, everything that we now take for granted in sort of relief efforts and trying to help people and humanitarian efforts. Really happened as a reaction to the Armenian genocide. And I say here, if you can read it, Babe Ruth actually gave one of his baseball bats for auction to go to the Near East Relief Fund. So it was a big deal in the 1920s in particular. People knew about it. It was forgotten over time, partially on purpose. partially because of World War II, the Great Depression, World War II, and loss of time. But nonetheless, nothing was done then, not because people didn't know about it. People did know about it. And today it is recognized, right? Thankfully by many institutions. Finally, the United States, 2019, the United States also recognized it. And as of 2022, all U.S. states and the District of Columbia recognize it. The International Association of Genocide, obviously, International Center for Transitional Justice, European Parliament, Council of Europe, World Council of Churches, right? Turkey will still say so-called genocide. Well, you know, these are the people who are calling it genocide. And it's a pretty robust list, including some Turkish scholars who have re-examined their past and really feel that it's important that Turkey recognize it in order that it has an honest reckoning of its own history. So, and that's very important. They're doing great work in the field, and it's an important work, and it's hard, right? There are real repercussions for them back home. So it's very difficult for them. But one last thing about this, I also want to emphasize that it wasn't just Armenians. Yes, the Armenians formed the largest group of people who were killed during the genocide, but it wasn't just them. Assyrian Christians were also killed. Contemporary reports record 200 to 250,000, possibly as high as 400,000 were killed in this period. Over half their population. And likewise, the Greeks. The Greek community of Anatolia was wiped out. The remnants of it, a lot of it had been moved earlier in population transfers, but the numbers range from 450 to 900,000. And the epitome of this was the catastrophe at Smyrna in 1922, in which we don't know how many people were killed, but Turkish military basically set the old town on fire and drove the population into the sea. And a lot of them drowned. And both of these were also recognized by the International Association of Genocide Scholars in 2007, as well as by the Republic of Armenia in 2015. So the Armenians also recognize these other two genocides to have happened along with theirs. Now, this is the historical genocide, and people who may have been at my lectures before or seen them, I never used to say the Armenian Genocide 1915 to 1923, because there was only one Armenian genocide. And now this is a more complex question of whether we're witnessing and we're in the middle of another genocide. And that's what I call the Armenian Genocide of 2023. And I'm not the only one who called it that. I'll get to it in a second. But this is the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. In Armenia, Nagorno-Karabakh is called Artsakh. That area is known as Artsakh. I will use both terms. But internationally, Nagorno-Karabakh is the way they've been reporting on it, so I'll use that. So talk a little bit about Nagorno-Karabakh. Nagorno-Karabakh is an Armenian enclave. It was ethnically majority Armenian, but it was within the Soviet Socialist Republic of Azerbaijan. There are many reasons, or again, the reasons are debated as to why the Soviet Union allowed these ethnic enclaves to continue the way they did. Usually what's the most common answer is that they were trying to make sure to break up populations so that they couldn't resist Sovietization, but people do debate that still. But it was an autonomous oblast in the USSR. That means it was within Azerbaijan, the Soviet Socialist Republic of Azerbaijan, but they had a degree of autonomy within it to do things the way they wanted. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, all of this then comes to the front, not just here, but throughout the former provinces. And as we get to the end of the Soviet Union, Nagorno-Karabakh voted to join Armenia. We also get a reaction in Azerbaijan of anti-Armenian pogroms. There was an Armenian population in Azerbaijan. They're basically forced to leave because the situation gets so bad. About 300,000 Armenians leave Azerbaijan. The Azeri population in the Armenian regions also leaves and goes back to Azerbaijan. So there's another population transfer. And then with the collapse of the Soviet Union, Armenia and Azerbaijan declare independence from the USSR. And Nagorno-Karabakh holds a referendum at which they basically said, we want to be independent. The Azeri population of the Azeri population of Nagorno-Karabakh was told not to participate, to boycott the vote, so they didn't participate in it. But you can see still 98%, and the Armenians formed the majority of it, voted for independence. This leads, there are skirmishes. This leads to a full-scale war between 1992 and 1994, in which miraculously the Armenians were able to become victors. They didn't look like they were going to win, but they were able to overcome odds then and defeat the other Azeri forces, and they were able to take over this area of Nagorno-Karabakh, as well as the shaded, the sort of darker shaded areas around it, in order to protect the area of Nagorno-Karabakh as well. You can see here as well the area of Nakhichevan. This was another Armenian area that had a large Armenian population, but the Soviets gave it to Azerbaijan, and they had these. So the Azeris, Soviet Socialist Republic of Azerbaijan had that also disjointed property as well, territory. And that's important because it allows us also to understand what the future of Nagorno-Karabakh may be now that it's under Azerbaijani control in a second. But this is the situation basically from 1994 until 2020, when Azerbaijan invaded Nagorno-Karabakh, crossed the line of contact on September 27th, 2020. They got lots of support from other countries, including Turkey, but they crossed over. They had superior military firepower very quickly. I mean, Armenians put up a brave defense, but they had neither the manpower nor the technology. Drones were used in this war, and they were able to. The Azerbaijani forces were able to take over, overwhelm Armenian forces, and they agreed, due to Russian intervention, to a ceasefire, right, on November 9th of 2020. And there were territorial losses for the Armenians. So all of that surrounding territory that you saw before went to Azerbaijan. And Nagorno-Karabakh was basically left on its own. They had their own government. They were the self-declared Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh with a legislature, with its own military, highly connected to Armenia, but independent of it. They had their own flag. They weren't recognized by any other country in the world, but still they had their own system, state institutions that were separate from Armenia, although heavily connected. They were now left in a limbo, and for the next few years, until the blockade began in 2022. So on December 12, 2022, the Azerbaijani government used the excuses of a few protesters to enforce a blockade on Nagorno-Karabakh and the 120,000 people who were inside of it, the inhabitants of the region. They were now, this blockade lasted for 9 months. It was very difficult to get food. It was very difficult to get medical supplies. People were starving. Child mortality rate in particular was very high. And they kept this going for 9 months. And what really ended it was that on September 19th, 2023, Azerbaijani forces attacked the Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh. And there was no way now, completely cut off, having had a blockade for 9 months, that they could do anything. The leadership surrendered and dissolved all state institutions. So the Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh ceased to exist. And shortly thereafterwards, on September 22nd, Luis Ocampo, who was the first chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, called what happened a genocide in a Washington Post op-ed, and said that if something doesn't happen, something doesn't change, this is the genocide of 2023. And nothing happened. By September 30th, over 100,000 people fled the region. And currently there are none. I mean, there are very few people left in Armenians left in Nagorno-Karabakh. You can see the lines of cars trying to get through. It was even dangerous. Most of them did wind up going to the Republic of Armenia. And this is part of the current concerns, the situation of the refugees. Most of them wound up going first to Armenia, but Armenia itself is not a large country, as you saw. It's not an incredibly wealthy country. How are they supposed to adapt to this new influx of Armenians? It's very difficult. They're trying to find ways to make sure that they're able to take care of them. They're obviously moving on to other areas as well, but it's a very painful situation because an entire culture they spoke Armenian, but they had their own dialect, they had their own way of customs, they had their own traditional traditions that are separate from the Republic of Armenia, although they felt akin to them. And this is now gone. It's just gone. And who knows if it's able to come back. The other concern is the destruction of Armenian cultural heritage. And this is why I mentioned Nakhichevan earlier, is that region, which was also heavily Armenian up until the Soviet period and the transfer over to Azerbaijan and the transfer of Armenians to Armenia, had many Armenian monuments, and Azerbaijan proceeded to destroy 98% of all Armenian sites in Nakhichevan. And this is, obviously they're not like reporting this, but you can see this from digital satellite imagery. And this is a church. It's a Holy Mother of God cathedral in the area of Kurna. This was actually an Armenian Catholic church. And it's one, personally, that one of the figures I wrote my PhD thesis on, this was his church. It's now gone. It no longer exists. It's been wiped completely off the map. This has happened also in Nagorno-Karabakh. So this church of Zoravor, another Mother of God church, but Armenian Apostolic, in Mekhkavan, has been totally eliminated. Or the other thing that happens is that Armenian inscriptions, such as that inscription, you can't really make it out, but there's an Armenian inscription. What they do is they erase them or destroy the Armenian inscription. So what they say that these were never Armenian churches, right? In some instances where they don't destroy the building itself, they say they're not Armenian churches and get rid of any evidence that it may have been Armenian by destroying that evidence. And in some instances, they've knocked down the building and put up a mosque in its place. So they destroyed the Armenian heritage. The other concern here, obviously the cultural heritage, and Christina Moranci, a colleague of mine at Harvard University, has done a lot to bring attention to the cultural heritage part. I also like to point out Simon Mahakian, who's out of Denver, has done a lot to bring this to the attention of the West about what's going on. And there's a whole website called Caucasus Watch, Caucasus Heritage Watch, that has pictures that's using satellite imagery of the destruction that's taking place. But in addition to the cultural heritage, there's the current concern about the rhetoric, the continued use of genocidal rhetoric, and now not just against the inhabitants of Nagorno-Karabakh who are all gone, but against the Republic of Armenia itself. And so we can note, for example, Erdogan, the president of the Republic of Turkey, during the war victory celebration in 2020, celebrated the achievements of the perpetrators of the Armenian Genocide, right? And was looking forward to having their heritage continue, right? Their legacy continue. And Aliyev, who was the president of Azerbaijan in 2018, refers to Yerevan, which is the capital of Armenia, as their historical land. And we, the Azerbaijanis, must return to these historical lands, i.e. they must take over Yerevan in Armenia. And as recently as 2022, it says Western Azerbaijan, that's the way they refer to the Republic of Armenia in Azerbaijan today, is our historical land. There are still skirmishes, particularly in the south of the region. If I go back quickly to the map here, Azerbaijan would like to link these territories with Nakhichevan, and the only way they can do it is by cutting through Armenia. And so right now the situation is rather grave. Whether Armenia will allow a corridor to be constructed that will link those two areas, or whether Azerbaijan will invade Armenia in order to make that a reality, is uncertain. Russia obviously is the largest power broker other than Turkey in the area, which doesn't bode well for anybody, considering that they have other things going on. And so this is a really dangerous situation. And, we're watching it unfurl before our eyes. I know for Armenians in the diaspora, as well as in Armenia, this is a concern. And again, a feeling of isolation and helplessness as they've watched Nagorno-Karabakh disappear, and now they're looking at the possibility of the Republic of Armenia disappearing. I wanted to conclude today's talk with a timeline topics of my visits in the last decade. And this is not just for me to reminisce nostalgically of my visits here, which have all been lovely, but it's sort of a strange, to me, a very strange progression. When I was here in 2015, 2015 was the centenary of the Armenian Genocide. And I talked about the events that were happening in connection with that commemoration. Events to educate people and to talk about the monument that I showed in an earlier slide that Fresno State had built. And all of this was done, all of these events, all of the monuments that were built were done with the hopes of preventing it ever happening again. Right? The next year, I came back and talked about how the Armenian Apostolic Church had canonized the victims in 2015. So that they were no longer victims, they were saints who could act as intercessors for the future. And I drew parallels between what was happening with the Yazidis by the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq and what happened 100 years ago, right? But again, this seemed very far away from what was happening to Armenians. Right? The Armenian Genocide was a historical event. What was happening to the Yazidis was a tragic current event. But again, this seemed removed from Armenia. And in 2019, I was able to talk about the Armenia exclamation point exhibit at the Met in December 2018. I mean, everybody came out for this. It was a huge opening. It once again, spotlighted Armenian cultural achievement over the centuries, to the wealthy and the famous and to politicians, reminding them, of the culture and the importance that Armenians have played in history. And then in 2020, it came here, and again, really happy. All right, because I was able to report about the fact that the Armenian Genocide had finally been recognized by the United States in 2019. And again, we're seeing these sort of positive movements, thinking we're moving in the right direction. Finally, America has been able to do this. And although that doesn't really change the things of Armenians themselves, I mean, it was something that we had to do for ourselves, right? To come to terms with our own history, how we tried to help as much as we could, and also just be honest about what happened. And then all of a sudden in 2021, as I said, this last part of my talk became about the Nagorno-Karabakh War, the Artsakh War of 2020. And I was talking about what's next. And again, this seemed theoretical. What's going to happen, right? And in 2023, last year I came here and I talked about the blockade of what was going on and the direness of the situation. And I actually put as the title of that slide, Prelude to Genocide, with a question mark. And now, they're gone. Thank you all.
Okay, so we're going to stop recording here for the question and answer period. And my apologies to people who were online. I understand there was an issue with the slides. I'll figure out what happened before our next talk, which is in 2 weeks. But as always, the privilege of the first question belongs to students in the class. So, Athena.
So in one of the books that we read, it says that it says that denial is the last part of genocide. Do you believe that we will ever see a point when the Armenian government recognizes what they
The Turkish government.
Yeah, the Turkish government recognizes it as a genocide?
I mean, I don't know. I'd like to think for their own sake, and as I think I mentioned, the Turkish scholars who are re-examining this aren't doing it. I mean, whatever their towards Armenians are, they aren't doing it for Armenians. They're doing it because they feel like it's absolutely. They feel like they're Turkish patriots. They're doing this for Turkey. that it needs to come to a recognition of this for its own self, so that it can have an honest reckoning with the past and be able to move forward. Right? And that civil liberties in Turkey will only be established for everybody once they're able to acknowledge this historical tragedy. You know, having said that, I'd like to believe that at some point Turkey will feel that way. But again, you know, a nice step would be to like try to stop what Azerbaijan is doing now. But they're not obviously interested in doing that either. They have a more complicated role. I don't want to simplify their role in the current situation, because even though Turkey and Azerbaijan are both Turkic, they're Turks, they're also Turkey is Sunni and Azerbaijan is Shia. So there are other latent conflicts between the two communities. So it's not as though they naturally go hand in hand with each other. But right now they see this as advantageous to both of their political situations. So right now they're able to align on that. You know, like I said, I hope they will, but